Swinburne University of Technology.
Hi everyone, in this video we are going to be looking at what we call measurement and scaling. And so this is the idea of trying to turn slightly more abstract questions and abstract thoughts into some sort of numerical measure that we can do some statistics on. So you can imagine if I wanted to find out someone's age, I could say, what is your age? And they would give me a number. And it'll be very easy for me to do some stats on that. But if I wanted to know how much they, say, like a particular product, liking something doesn't immediately have a number attached to it. So what I need to be able to do is come up with a way of measuring this idea of liking in a way that I can do comparisons and be able to do some stats. So we're going to be looking at 7 different scaling techniques. 3 of them are what we call comparative scales and 4 are what we call non-comparative scales. And as we look at them, you'll notice that the difference is whether we're comparing different items or different things to one another. So we're going to go through each of these 7 and look at some examples. You may recognize, probably the most common one that you may recognize on this chart is the Likert scale, and we'll be coming to that one at the end, and that's going to be the one that we're probably going to spend the most time focusing on. So our first one is what we call a paired comparison. So a paired comparison is exactly what it sounds like. We want to find out about people's preferences, so we give them a series of pairs. So you can see here that I want to find out about someone's car preferences, and so I am giving them a pair of car brands and saying, which one do you prefer? And then another one, another one, another one. Based on this, I will be able to get a picture of what car brand the person prefers. There's 2 main difficulties with this method. The first is sometimes you might get some inconsistencies. So you might find that the person prefers Holden to Ford, and they prefer Hyundai to Holden, but then they prefer Ford to Hyundai. So that's inconsistent. So that can be a problem with actually trying to get a order to someone's preferences if they've ticked the boxes in an inconsistent manner. The second problem is that if we have a lot of categories, comparing them pairwise really blows up into far too many comparisons very quickly. You can imagine if we had, say, 8 or 10 different car brands and we had to compare every one with every single other one, that would end up being a lot of work for our survey recipients. So one way around this, another way for us to get a good picture of people's preferences, is with what we call rank order. So this is where we give a list of categories or items, and we get people to rank them from most important to least important. So with this one we can say that number 1 is most important, number 8 is least important, and we're getting people to attach numbers to each of these items. So this gets around the problem of having to do lots and lots of pairwise comparisons. One problem we could run into is if we have categories that perhaps people either don't want to or have a lot of difficulty in ranking. So with my example that I have here, we've got different job-related categories, but perhaps someone considers salary and job satisfaction to be equally important. We have to remember that the things on this list are not mutually exclusive. So mutually exclusive means if you have one, you can't have the other. So it might be that I don't want a job unless it has a good salary and it has good job satisfaction. So I want to rank both of those 1, but perhaps I'm not able to if I have to use the numbers 1 through to 8. The other thing with this particular list we'd need to be a little bit careful of is where we have differences in rankings between groups. So you can see there's the item there, paid maternity/paternity leave. So if I just got the ranks for all of my participants and just averaged it out to get an average rank for that item, what I might lose is differences between gender. We could find that males and females value their maternity leave and their paternity leave quite differently from one another. So we do need to be quite careful when we are looking at our rank order and analysing it, because if we average out, we could be losing information where there's differences between groups. Our next one is what we call constant sum. So with a constant sum, we're given a particular number, and we have to disperse this number between groups. So in this example that I've given, we've got the university as $100,000, and we're indicating where that money should be spent. So in a way, we're showing our preference for the spending, but we're doing it in a slightly different way. Rather than saying, let's rank each of these, instead we're saying how much money should we spend on each of these. Another common place that we'll see constant sum is where we are looking at particularly kind of food and beverage type surveys, where you might get a question along the lines of describing your last 10 alcoholic drinks. So you might have a list of different kinds of beers and wines and spirits, and you will need to list how many of each the last 10 were. This kind of question tends to work a lot better on a web survey than on a paper survey. Sometimes on a paper survey, people run into some problems with their adding. So we might have asked them to allocate 100,000, or we might have asked them about their last 10 drinks, and maybe they've said 5 and 4 and 3. And so that's more than 10, and that's a little bit problematic for us. With a web survey, we can have a check there. So before they can move on to the next question, our survey will check that the numbers that they've entered add up to the sum that we have asked for. So this one is what we call a continuous ranking. Continuous ranking is where we give our participants a line. Notice there's actually no numbers on the line, and we ask a question or give a statement, and we want them to place a mark somewhere along that line that in this case is indicating their enjoyment of statistics. And so what we would do when we analyze this is we would convert that distance along the line into a number. It's going to be a little bit tricky if we're doing a paper survey because you've got to sit there and measure it. With a web survey, it's a lot easier because there'll just be a little dragger, and the participant will be able to drag the little point back and forth to wherever they think is appropriate, and the web survey will automatically record a number associated to that position. So it's a lot easier to use this one with a web survey than with a paper survey. Those of you that have seen the movie Donnie Darko might recall there's a point in that movie where there is a continuous rating scale and Donnie's asked to put a point on it. However, with that one, the categories at each end don't really make a lot of sense. It's not really a particularly useful continuum. So when we're using this, we do need to make sure that we can actually have something meaningful gained from placing the point on the line. Okay, now we're going to look at our 3 different itemized rating scales. So we've got the 3 listed there, and you can see that I've also given a link to Wikipedia. So hopefully if you've done other university courses, you will have had highlighted to you that Wikipedia is not a very good source in terms of referencing an essay, and the reason for that is the reliability and the validity of the information on Wikipedia is a little bit questionable because pretty much anyone can go on there and edit it. Having said that, if we just want to find out about things, we're not using it as evidence to back up statements, we're not using it as evidence to back up things that we're saying, it can be really useful just for finding out about stuff. And so I've given you a link there, you can see for scale, social sciences, and you can go and read a whole lot more about scales. You'll get a lot more information beyond what I can squeeze into this video. Okay, so our staple scale is one where we would typically go from -5 to +5, but one of the key things with it is that there is no 0. So you could imagine that this -5 to +5 could be strongly agree to strongly disagree or some kind of continuum like that. But there's no zero, no middle point. So there's no way for you to be able to neither agree nor disagree. You can't sit on the fence. This is going to be good for some kinds of questions and not so good for others. Sometimes you want to give people the opportunity to not have a feeling, to not necessarily agree or disagree. So you want them to either be positive or negative and not sit in the middle. Other times you do want to give them that opportunity. So it depends a little bit on what you're trying to find out as to whether you want to use a staple scale and actually force people into being positive or negative. You can do this with the Likert scales as well. Okay, so our next one, a semantic differential scale. This is where we have a what we call bipolar labels. So that means we've got opposites at each end of our scale. So you can see here we've got caring and uncaring, well-groomed and messy, polite and rude. So for each of these descriptions, you're making a value judgment somewhere along the set of 7 points. So again, quite useful if it's something where we're trying to get a contrast. So with this one, caring versus uncaring, polite versus rude. You're not seeing whether someone agrees or disagrees, you're trying to get a judgment somewhere across a description. Okay, so our last one is called Likert scale, and this is the most commonly used, and this is the one that I'm going to be getting you to use when you are doing your assignment and writing multi-item scales, which we're going to learn about in the next video. So normally a Likert scale will have somewhere between about 5 and 9 options, sometimes 4 along the top. So you can see with this one we've got 5. We go from strongly disagree to strongly agree. Most commonly there'll be multiple statements to answer, so it won't just be one, there'll be a whole list of them that you're agreeing and disagreeing to. And again, that's what we call a multi-item scale, and we'll be learning about in the next video. So the most common are the strongly agree to strongly disagree, but this is not the only options that get used. So on the next slide I'll show you an example of one where it's got slightly different categories that the person can choose from. So this one comes out of a scale called the Rosenberg Self-Esteem Scale, and you can see we have the statement, and if we went and looked up this particular scale, we'd see there's a whole lot of similar kinds of statements. So a statement, all in all, I'm inclined to think that I'm a failure, and you can see that we've got these different options. So we go from almost always true down to never true. Scales, and Likert scales in particular, are very, very popular with psychology. So in psychology there's a lot of different scales, and they get used to measure a lot of these kind of underlying traits that you couldn't just ask someone about. So things like depression and social anxiety and happiness and sadness, and this one here you can see is self-esteem. By providing people with a whole lot of statements that they need to try and describe themselves. Okay, so here's a couple of the considerations when we are using a scale. So if we are creating our own scale, first is the number of categories, the number of options. So normally it's somewhere between about 4 and 9. Two things that we should keep in mind. One is that if we're doing a phone survey, we definitely want it to be fewer because it'll just take a long time to read them out. And secondly, if the participants are not that knowledgeable. So if it's going to be hard for them to distinguish say a slightly true from a normally true, or usually true from a always true, these kind of little subjective differences, people tend to get more caught up on if they're being asked about something they're not very knowledgeable about. Need to decide whether we're going to have the same number of positive and negative responses. Most of the time you tend to have a bit of balance, but there could be reasons why you might have more positive or more negative ones. You might need to decide whether you have an odd or even number of categories. So remember when we looked at the staple scale, it always has a even number so that there's no zero, no option for a midpoint of kind of neither agree nor disagree, or not positive or negative. Whereas if we have an odd number, there's going to be that funny middle. Last thing we need to consider is whether we have a don't know or not applicable option. When we're asking or giving a statement for someone to agree or disagree to, what if it's not applicable to them? So we need to think about whether all of our items are going to be applicable, and hopefully most of the time they are, but depending on what we're asking, we may want to or may need to give a don't know or not applicable option.
This has been a Swinburne production.